Hi, I'm Dr. Lauren Esposito, and you are tuned into the Institute for Biodiversity Science and Sustainability seminar series. Today, we are joined by Dr. Tanjona Ramiadantsoa, who is a theoretical ecologist from Madagascar. He's currently the scientific director and graduate program coordinator at our very own Madagascar Biodiversity Center. He obtained a master's degree in mathematics in Madagascar before starting a PhD in ecology and evolution at the University of Helsinki, Finland, with Ilkka Hanski and Otso Ovaskainen. He then completed a 2-year postdoc at the University of Minnesota's Twin Cities and a 3-year postdoc at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a 1-year postdoc at the University of Montpellier. He returned to Madagascar in 2020 to do research and to train young scientists, especially in quantitative methods. I'll hand it over to him. He'll be talking about Goldilocks models in ecology and evolution.
Okay, so I guess it's fine if I take off my excuse is that I have an accent and like this, it'll be easier to read my lips. So thanks for the introduction. She did very well also in pronouncing my name. So congrats to that. Welcome everyone online, and it's also great to have some of my fellows here. They asked me to give the talk in my native language, but that might be difficult. So I'm not going to take this very seriously in the sense that I know this is an academic talk, but let's just have fun, right? Okay, so yes, I'm currently the director of science or scientific director of Madagascar Biodiversity Center. I guess you all know about that center, so I will not give an introduction. I will still talk a little bit at the end. I hope we'll have, this is like 45 minutes sharp, right? Or, okay, so it's, just to be sure. Where do I start? Actually, this is kind of a, it's not funny, but interesting situation because I did, while I was still living in the US, I did a road trip from the Midwest down to California. And San Francisco was one of that stops. And this was actually the best part of my visit in San Francisco. Like the Golden Gate Bridge was like, that's it. But then I found like, yeah, Walt Disney was also fine. But then I walked here, and this is one of the kind of the pleasant places. Then who knew that, I don't know, 10 years later, I will be giving a talk here and also welcome. And so it's kind of a little, it feels a little bit weird inside me. That's why I'm not taking it so seriously too. I mean, I had so much fun here and I want to continue doing that. So, I mean, if someone dares or try to look at my resume or like the papers I've published and trying to figure out what I've been doing and what I'm doing, it's literally all over the place. Like I've worked on pretty much any systems from insects to primates to conservation biology to phylogenies to agricultural system in the US. And of course, due to COVID, most of the quantitative ecologists or those who have skills in modeling start to do something a little bit like that. So I usually never define myself in terms of systems, but there's one like common theme there is that as Lauren already said, like I'm a theoretical ecologist. So out of curiosity, how many of you actually have worked with theoretical ecologists in the past? Okay, 2, cool. How many have read a theoretical ecology paper in the past? 2. Okay, so it's a field that I understand. I mean, when I did my PhD, I had actually to explain to non-ecologists like what is theoretical ecology, because you think of ecology going into the field and doing all this taxonomic work, and then there's theory in front of it, and so what we're doing. So I will not go too much in details about that, but my point is that to a certain extent we are not very known. We don't really know what we are used for to a certain extent, and so the majority of this talk is given a little bit more context and how we maybe still fit in this modern thing. So to give another perspective, we sometimes talk about this golden age of theoretical ecology. And this is one paper that came out, I actually forgot when it is, but it's about like 100 articles that every ecologist should read. And actually, when you look at the authors, most of them or theoretical ecologist in some sense. It kind of created a backfire back then because most of the authors looked like this, which is not the type of diversity that we want to portray, but they were like the great theoretical ecologists in the past, just like, I don't know, Robert MacArthur, for instance, and Wilson are there, and a lot of people probably have heard about those things. So theory is trying to give this broad perspective, like how nature works. But kind of things are changing, especially for the last, I don't know, 20 and 10 years, where we are now swimming in this era of big data. So all those omics, genomics, and all those things, eDNA, we're flooded with data. And this gives a slightly different perspective of how we do research from the very simplistic, mechanistic way of how theoretical ecology works. Now we have all this data and we're trying to make sense out of it. I mean, remote sensing, actually, I have no idea how much data we're gathered every day by NASA and all those satellites up there. Ecologists also have like NEON. Has anyone heard about NEON in the past? So we're collecting large-scale data here in North America, multifaceted. Even in aquatic, they have this flame where we actually crisscross the lakes at high speed. So you have high resolution data about oxygens and carbon dioxide, and of course, the newcomer is citizen science. So we're literally flooded with data. And this is kind of in parallel with how our computational ability has also increased. We now have super powerful computers that can crunch a lot of numbers and do a lot of calculations for us. And also, of course, the new fancy style now, machine learning. Spoiler alert, theoretical ecologists are still like on the back, like, well, let's make sure that we don't just put everything in our data and the computer will tell us what to do. But I mean, okay, I wouldn't say we, I would just say I, because I cannot speak for the theoretical ecologists. But we are in this thing where we come from the simple mind of like Bob May, who is probably one of the greatest theoretical ecologists, and there's new guys coming. Has anyone heard about Hadley Wigman? Okay, so a lot of people who are working at R and ggplot and RStudio, I don't know if I can say this online. Everyone praises him, and he has done amazing things, but we're almost falling in two camps, where there's the theoretician on one hand, and then there's the data scientist on the other hand. And part of this talk is like, why don't we find a compromise? And that's where the Goldilocks is somehow common. Like, aren't we actually be better if we combine those things instead of sitting on both sides? And I don't know if I should be proud of this next slide, but I can make a little comparison with basketball. So this is in the 80s. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was doing this skyhook, which is very efficient. Nobody could guard it. And I think he's the top scorer in the history of NBA. And so on one hand, we have this guy who says, like, get close to the basket and it's easier to score. And then on the other hand, we have this. And I guess most of you are a fan of this, but now the game is somehow changing. Maybe not. But if there's one place where I might get the crowd cheering, maybe it's here. So things are changing. I mean, we're looking at things differently, and so again, thinking about a compromise. I mean, maybe something in between or combining those two would actually make the team unbeatable. Let's say in that sense. Okay. So before I lose you with all my jokes and stories and pictures, I'm just gonna start with the take-home messages, which I've already introduced. That Goldilocks can be actually a good approach. And the main point here is that when we're trying to understand a system, we often need to think about the mechanisms instead of just looking for what the data is telling us. I've been talking to some statisticians in the past and how we can avoid those spurious correlation and things like that. And one way to overcome that is just thinking about why is it doing that instead of just describing that we have that. And I hope I will have time. That's the science part, but I will also talk about the training that we're doing in Madagascar, because that's also a big part of my talk. And so there's going to be like three major parts. I'm going to talk about the present. I'm going to talk about this model trying to understand disturbance system. and that's ongoing. It's actually in review right now, and I'm going to talk about the past project. Whoops, I'm sorry, which actually captures that idea. It's kind of an old paper, so for those who are very active in phylogenetic comparative methods, you might scream like, okay, that's too old, but it's not about the method per se, it's also about the ideas behind it that I want to talk. And then the future, like how we're planning to train students in Madagascar. Okay, so this first project is actually done while I was in Wisconsin with Monica Turner here and Zach Radazak. I don't know, oops. So disturbance is something that we often see in the news. Sometimes this is this dramatic things, but for most ecological systems, disturbance is actually a natural process. All the things that we are seeing here, they've happened before. It's not the only time. It's sometimes we see that our human time scale that we think that ecosystem will be ruined because of disturbance, and they can be of many natures. But in reality, nature already have found some solutions depending on the disturbance that we're occurring. So mangrove, for instance, they can resist flood, so they have roots that are adapted to that. There are some trees that have really, really, really dense hood, so that when hurricane comes, they will be able to withstand the sheer force of the wind. And some trees have very, very thick bark. Sorry. That would actually, oopsie. That would allow them to survive fires. So they actually have strategies to do that. And even in the most extreme disturbance, so this is the after the Mount Sentinel eruptions, like decades later, the vegetation will come back. So it's not the end of the world when it happens in this case. Even those high severity fires, your trees have ability to resprout quickly after that. Okay, so essentially, in theory, or in general, ecosystems are resilient to historical disturbance regime. And we're talking about disturbance regime because it's just not one event. It depends on several characteristics. So in general, there's like three main axes: how frequent, so it's the temporal axis, the size of the disturbance, and severity or intensity. So severity often refers to how much it kills the vegetation. So high severity fire, for instance, will just kill all the trees there, whereas a low severity might mean that it's just surface fire or something like that. Intensity often refers to like a physical constant of like how much power there is in the disturbance. But for these historical disturbance regimes, some species have adopted some strategy to regenerate here. So resistor, I would call it resistor, those who just not affected by the disturbance. They have developed something. But for high severity disturbance, you need a strategy to come back. And so there are generally three main strategies for that. There's what we call like ex situ seeders. So it comes from patches that are not burned or killed by the disturbance, so they will just reseed after that. Then there's in situ, those are the specialists. So they actually depend often on fire to regenerate. And then there is the sprouter, so they will come from the back, from the bottom. And it can, there are several mechanisms how it occurs, but essentially for a certain disturbance regime, we already have a set of species that is adapted to those systems. The problem here, as you probably all know, that those regimes are changing, whether it's in frequency, severity, or size. And I don't think I'm probably the last person to talk about fire in California, but we're seeing that more and more often. It happens all over the world. So although the disturbance can be some sort of like seen or understood from different type of disturbance, I'm going to talk about fire here, and I'm going to give a concrete example. Oh, I'm sorry, later on. But when you try to understand then if a system is resilient for future disturbance, what do we do? And so this is where, okay, let's think about the data. And the problem is data is very limited. On one hand, because, I mean, to a certain extent, disturbances are rare. Like fire, I mean, it's becoming more and more frequent, but some disturbance like occurs over 10 years or 20 years. And for a lifetime of a researcher, that's not much data. We can go to the lab and try to grow seeds and put them in different environmental conditions, dry, hot, humid, whatever. But you will require a lot of factorials to do this, and that will help you to understand one system. Timeframes are really bad of like lifespan of the trees, and we still don't know how future disturbance will look like. And so the data approach here is limited. We can think about a more modeling theoretical approach. And this is how they did it in the past. Those are old papers. It's one line of equations, and we're trying to understand how patch works, how community will change as you change disturbance, which is not useful in the sense they lay the foundation for how disturbance and community changes, but we cannot apply it to any system at this level. Well, because of computers, we can also have like very, very sophisticated models that will allow you to simulate disturbance at a certain detail. So there are many of them. They can even measure like carbon storage and all those things. The problem there is that you have to know all the parameters of that system. So you have to measure a lot of things in the field. You can maybe estimate later, but it's really intensive. And again, you're trying to understand a system, a particular systems. If you run this model, for instance, it might take months to complete. So this is where I'm actually coming with the Goldilocks. It's like, is there something in between that we can use to answer certain type of questions that are more general? So that's what we did. I was trying to tease the Malagasy students here that maybe they will have an exam after this seminar to see how much they understood. But I'm just giving this shout out to him. So the Goldilocks is based on this cartoon where this lady is entering the bear house or whatever, the three little bears, and she's trying to figure out what is the right fit. So that's why we're using that Goldilocks. That will be in the exam, okay? I guess you nodded that I somehow explained it clearly. So, okay, so we're trying to find a balance, actually, a trade-off between generality and realism. So I'm going to give a concrete example. Some of us might remember that Yellowstone, which was like the first natural park, burned in '88. About a third of Yellowstone burned during that year, and it was a high severity fire. It was all over the news that this ecosystem is ruined, everything is burned. There's discussion about fire management and everything like that. And then this tried to map, and this is how it looked like. I mean, a third of the park burned, and there's some patches of forest trees that are all killed. Some ecologists weren't surprised by this because they have been doing like core analysis of fire frequencies, and they realized that those fire happens over 100 to 300 years period, and especially they know that this would happen. So even when you have like those high severity fire, forest came back strong and dense in some places. This is actually us doing field work there, and that is like hundreds of thousands of seedlings and saplings in this area. So they regenerated quickly, and that is due to the serotonin cone. This is a fire specialist. The cone look like this, and the seeds are sealed inside until fire comes in. They're released. This is like a bank, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands, if not millions of seeds that creates actually a regeneration like that. So to a certain extent, again, we shouldn't be worried too much, but again, disturbance are changing. So how can we anticipate what's happening? So for Yellowstone, just to recapitulate, there's three types of regeneration strategies. There's the ex situ seeders. So the seed source come from a burned area outside. And then there's the in situ triggers, in situ seeders. So actually it's the fire that triggers the seed release. And then in Yellowstone, there's also the resprouter. So it's mainly quake and aspen, and they would just come resprout if fire comes in. So the above ground is all killed in all those situations. So the question that we're trying to ask is actually, so how do they actually fare if disturbance regime is changing? And actually having multiple strategies. So by strategies, I mean here regeneration strategies will enhance resilience. And by resilience here, just like how much forest will still left. And so the question here then is like, we're trying to fill this biplot here, where we see like if we change the fire-free interval and if we change the fire radius, how the forest will change. Okay. And so this is the fun part for me, but this is the most annoying part for my audience, unless they're theoretical ecologists. So I'm just going to skim over this part. And essentially, we build a system where the three strategies here, there's the non-serotinous lodgepole pine, there's the serotinous pine that requires time to build up. Actually, I'm going to leave this for a second. That we're going to build serotonin first, and then And then there's the aspen where they can regenerate. And there's some competition mechanisms that are occurring here, not going too much into details about that. But we have also been using this state-of-the-art way of modeling individual-based models. So we're just picking, we didn't build from scratch. And this framework was actually very powerful in doing what we're trying to do and making the model flexible. Okay. So more results. So this is example of the simulation that we have been doing. So the circle here, or the dots, they are the trees on the top for the 3 different strategies: non-serotonin spine, and resprouting aspen. And the X and Y here are spatial coordinates. It's not fire frequency, but we just want to have a look at what happens in the system if we actually burn them. And you can actually see in the left here that the serotonin spine, it kills all the trees, and then the seedlings are starting to come there, those little crusts that comes from seeds from the outside. For the serotonin spines, this is what we expected. Once you kill them, there's going to be a flood of seeds, and it will just regenerate. So you have those high density seedling 1 year after. And then the aspen, the diamonds here represent the roots. So the above ground is again killed, but then they will start to resprout gradually. So this is kind of reassuring to see that it produces something that we'll see in reality, despite the fact actually that this is still a very simple model compared to the island and Landis 2 and things that I've showed before. Okay, so what did we do? So now we run that model for all different combinations of fire size and fire frequency. And this is again where the Goldilocks play, because if we run them again in the process-based, it might take months, years, whereas in this case, I might get the result in 1 day. Okay, so the question was like how each regeneration strategy will fare if fire size and frequency changes. And so going back, so here on the x-axis, we still have the fire-free interval, so some sort of like inverse the frequency. So the longer it is, so this is, for instance, like 100 years, fire comes every 100 years. And on the y-axis, we have the radius of the fire. And the colors here represent the density of the fire. And they just responded differently. So for instance, for the non-serotonin spine here, the more you increase the fire frequency and size, the less dense the trees are. And at some point, you're gonna find a threshold here around this 50 orange line. That's when actually they will be extirpated. Yeah, so they will go extinct. So they would not be able to regenerate anymore. Whereas for the serotonin spines, they actually prefer fire, and above this 100 orange line, that's when they will attain their maximum density. For the aspen, they have a slightly different. So for instance, in this example, they will persist even at very high fire density. This is an example. This is the nice theoretical exercise where we can just simulate one strategy and see how they behave. This is an analogy to the fundamental niche that people use to learn in ecology. But we can also run it for different like mix, so that we put them together and see how they behave. And we're still very surprised and happy with these results, because it's kind of similar to what we see in the reality in the field for the study that we are doing. So when there's very, very few or rare forest, rare disturbance regime, it's dominated by non-serotonin spines. So on the left here, they're most abundant. And then as you move further, as you increase the disturbance regime, then the serotonin spines become more dominant. And then aspen is actually really rare here, will only start to show up when fire regime is around like 20 years of fire rotation. And so interestingly, that's exactly what we're seeing in Yellowstone to a certain extent. We will see different places. Now that sometimes fire occurs every 20 years or 10 years in some areas, we start to actually see aspen coming in. So essentially, we're constructing here how they will respond across like a large combination of parameter space. And the other question that we ask too is whether multiple strategy enhance resilience. And just compare the colors here. So on the left, the 3 plots are the same as I've shown before, how the stem density would actually change as a function of fire regime. And then on the right, this is when we put all the forests together, and it's just darker. That's the point here, that the stem density would actually be higher if we put the species together, even though they are competing against amongst themselves. Okay. So the first take home here is that in terms of like empirical insight, those non-serotonin spines, they are somehow limited by space. I have to come back here and explain that a little bit. So essentially what's happening here is that once you increase fire size, they actually have lower density than if you just change frequency. And so that's what we meant by non-serotonists are limited by space. The serotonin spine here are limited by time. And this is a known phenomenon. We didn't invent it. It's called the maturity risks. So when you have those serotonin cones, it takes time for them to build up. And if fire comes before they build up, it's kind of a useless strategy in some sense. Resprouters, as we have noticed here, they're less competitive. So their absence, for instance, in Yellowstone for the last 100 years is probably due to competition. And as I've said earlier, like even in the simple model, we can directly relate it to what is happening in the field. From the theoretical side now, we try to infer here is the disturbance niche, and we're making really the analogy of the niche in ecology where we have fundamental and realized niche. The advantage of that model is actually you can adapt it to most any disturbance model. It doesn't have to be fire. It can be any systems. And that was one of the main goals that we're building a tool to understand that. And from even a more general perspective, we were trying to prove this response diversity or portfolio aspect with just having the species or groups with different strategies actually enhance resilience in the system. I'm gonna stop there for the ecology and fire. Does anyone have like questions or something like that before I move into a very old paper? Or we can also keep them at the end. I guess that's one thing. So yes, this is old. This is something I did during my PhD. I kind of didn't follow as closely as much this line of literature because I was distracted. So I'll be happy for someone to point out that you're too old in this case, and we haven't thought about that anymore. Okay, but this is work I've done in my PhD, and now I'm thinking about the macroevolutionary processes. Well, the simpler question actually is species richness varies in space. At any scale you're going to look at, it's never going to be uniform. Some areas will have more species than others. Some have very, very few species. And it's not necessarily even consistent across taxonomic group. And so I guess we are all curious of like, why is that the case? And if you go back in time, there are those like old, this is again theory, not even required mathematics. Like we have the Wallace line, there's a difference between the species composition is actually because there's some dispersal barrier to the system. So they eventually evolve differently. One of the Malagasy people's favorite talk is island biogeography. You'll probably see that in every master's thesis in ecology that I know. Do you have it in your thesis? No? Okay. Don't be shy. Okay, so that's some sort of like the broad conceptual thing, but of course we have moved past those things and we're trying to do something more quantitative. And there's basically two types of phylogenetic comparative methods and trying to infer those processes. And one of them is pure correlation. And so we have the phylogeny are trying to understand how the traits correlates at the tips of the phylogeny. And the idea behind those methods is that we're trying to, how I'm going to explain it, we're trying to add a structure to the error term. So it's in the assumption in the model that the autocorrelation in the species or the non-independence of the species has to be accounted when you do the regression. That's essentially what those methods are doing. It's pure correlation. There's another familiar families of models that actually required a little bit more mechanistic understanding. And just so that I can give myself a little break, has anyone already worked on some of those things, those macroevolutionary models, phylogenetic comparative methods? Here? One, two? It's like the one who's doing theory knows about those things. Anyway, so what they're trying to do is like, if you see a phylogeny, can you actually understand the process that generated that phylogeny? And one of the very cool paper, although it's not Stadler who came up with that idea, but she explained it very well in her paper, is that if you look at the number of species that accumulate through time, you can roughly estimate how much speciation there is and how much extinction there are. And the idea here is on the top one, there's something called like the pool of the present term, which essentially species that arises during like closer to the present didn't have enough time to go extinct, and so there's this a little bit spike there, and because of that shape we can both estimate the lambda here, which is the speciation rate, and the mu here, which is the extinction rate. So that is some sort of like a cool result, theoretical result. Of course, people went beyond that, and instead of just estimating speciation rate or extinction rate, we can actually think like, does it depend on something else? And so maybe does it depend on body size, for instance? And they've developed several methods. So this is one kind of started all of them. It's called the excessive state speciation extinction model. But the point there is that it now has a mechanistic. So they build a model in the back that simulates the phylogeny and then trying to estimate the parameters that will produce the phylogeny that we observed. So we're very excited about that during my PhD, and they just finished this, I mean, not finished, this reconstruction of this phylogeny of dung beetles in Madagascar, and trying to understand actually if those different ecoregions in Madagascar has different rate of speciation, extinctions, and colonization here. So we're trying to estimate like speciation, extinction, and dispersal or colonization for each region, and essentially just trying to explain how biodiversity is generated in Madagascar. But, oh, and just another comment. So the difference here is that the dung beetles is an example of adaptive radiation. So it generally has two features. One is that what is it? The traits are very diversified and they're adapted to their environments. We have the Darwin finches, but I'm from Madagascar, so I'm going to use the vangas here. It's the same concept. And I think they're cuter, don't you think? If you go to Madagascar, you can do a list of, I want to see all the vangas. So that's one thing. They're adapted to their environment. They're very diversified. The other part is that because niche was quite open when they started to radiate, there was a lot of opportunity. The speciation was off the roof, or diversification was really high. And then as the niche starts to fill in, there's no more opportunities, so speciation will start to decrease. Or put it differently, if we see how species accumulates through time, it's going to start to flatten at some point. So that is what we had. And so we're trying to figure out, like, are there methods that can do that? And again, this is old, so I don't know what happens with those methods now, but there are some methods that try to estimate extinction and dispersal across several regions, but they didn't estimate speciation, so that didn't work. There's this one. This is a very fancy one also that tries to estimate speciation, extinction, and dispersal, but it only works for 2 regions, because that's what they needed in that system. They had a system and they look at this. So it's binary trait. There are others that account for diversity dependence. So this is where we start to flatten because there's no more niche. But again, it doesn't depend on state. And I was foolishly enough to embark in this thing, like, let's just build the new model that will try to estimate actually all those parameters. And so that's what we did. We tried to develop a general model to handle as many regions as you needed, try to estimate diversification there, but also add this diversity dependence. So we're adding 2 things, which was a bad idea sometimes because we're really trying to do too many things at one time. Okay, so there's the mechanistic models that we're having here. I'm caricaturizing the system with patches here, and the arrows represent the dispersal. So there's very little like east-west colonization in Madagascar. So we try to already limit the number of parameters that we are using here. We even, instead of having 5 regions, to make it simpler, let's look first at 3 regions. So the west will have the same parameters, the east will have the same parameters, and then we have the north. And then there's 2 types of speciation event that we're talking here. There's the within region speciation, and there's the between region speciation. Did I say special? Should be speciation, sorry about that. Speciation rate. So that's essentially allopatric speciation across region. There's 1 parameter for colonization. So we're already trying to simplify the model. And then once we have that, I can always put whatever parameters I want, and I can run it, and it will give me a phylogeny, right? But is that similar to what we're trying to have? And we made a kind of bold decision. Well, it's not bold. We couldn't actually do the traditional statistical approach. So we used something called approximate Bayesian computation. Again, so that I'm not the only one talking here. Anyone has already worked or heard about approximate Bayesian computation? One, we need to talk, right? So essentially, one of the tricky thing when you do this estimation is trying to solve this likelihood function, try to reconstruct it and that's sometimes limitations. That's usually why those people have those simplifying models in the past, because they can write down the likelihood. In this kind of more sophisticated model we couldn't write down, or I didn't even try to write it down. When I heard these things like, well, let's just try the approximate Bayesian computation, or also known as ABC. And it's a very simple thing, actually. It's a really simple algorithm where you pick a random parameters, or in the space parameters, right? Do that. You simulate the model. And then you see that the parameter is if your real simulated data is similar to the real data, then you say that this parameter is accepted. So you do that millions of times. And then eventually you sample actually from all the parameters. That produce something similar to the data. And this is a nice method, because you can then build any models you want, as detailed as you want. You just need to be able to compare them. And just to give an example of how it works, this is like you have a sleeper and you're trying to find the right person. And then you just ask, and I think that's what Prince Charming, I mean, he didn't do it. He asked whatever to like, try this, and eventually, luckily, it only works for one, but I would bet that in reality, it would fit to other problems. So this is what we call summary statistics. It's just like how we compare your real data with the simulated data. I think that the idea in Cinderella is, in the modern version, is that Prince Charming was just too lazy to to find a wife, so he just organized a ball and then like, okay, there's one sleeper. If he was a little bit more statistician, he probably would have looked for other summary statistics. So can someone dance, or look at the height of the person, or even hairstyle. So I like to add Disney's in my talk, but I guess, yeah, that's essentially the point of the summary statistics. So you're trying to find other metrics that would allow you to compare your simulated data with the real data. And so when we did this, we actually thought about dozens of summary statistics. So this is the pattern that we have. Our simulation will produce something like this. How we want to compare them? And there we tried many, but at the end we actually retained 4. That was more informative. And what is the number of species per region? So for instance, the orange red here is the north. How many species are present there? We'll look at the distribution. So some have like more restricted, the others are distributed more widely. So we look at that. We look at the similarity between sister species. So in this case, they have exactly the same distribution. In this one they don't have. And we also include some sort of like the branch length here, so relative phylogenetic diversity. Essentially we counted the length of those things and then scale it by the crown, so at the bottom, so that we can compare. So this is our way of comparing our simulation with this real figure, and we're just going to generate a lot of parameters, select those, and see how it works. Well, so what happened? Of course it didn't work. It didn't work. So what we did is we make it some sort of like inference. So is our statistical machinery, does it work? And on the y-axis, on the top x-axis, you have the true parameter. So what we did is like we pick the parameter, simulate that, and then try to estimate the parameters back. And they should be along this one-to-one line, and they're just all over the place. Didn't work. The bottom here just showing the error. So it didn't work. I'm going to come back later why it didn't work, but we have to simplify. And to do that, we essentially fixed all the extinction to 1. And now instead of estimating extinction and speciation, we're just estimating speciation, and it works. I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, of course, it's noisy, but you see that they almost fit on that really one line. So now we're a bit more confident that our inference works, and we can now use the real data. And so we did that, and this is the result. So this is the more important result. So essentially, when we look at the within speciation rate, you notice that the posterior distribution, it's higher in the north, and then it's somehow middle in the east, and then it's lower in the west. And this is also somehow different to the frequentist approach, where we're just going to say, like, this is the parameter with the standard error or the standard deviation. We're just providing the posterior distribution here. As you have seen here, the allopatric doesn't work, so we're not giving too much thought to that. It's very difficult to estimate that. But the colonization here as well. I don't know if you can see if I do this. So we're able to estimate those parameters. And so the take home here is essentially that the diversification rate is higher in the north and then lowest actually in the south. And people have already considered those, but we're kind of putting a numbers into that. And why is that the case? So this is so far theory, but I hope it makes sense, is that the north is actually topographically complex. Like there's mountains there from all directions, and those heterogeneity might actually favor speciation or species diversification. The other aspect, for instance, the west here is really flat. The east is just sloped on one side. So although there's also a lot of species there, not as many as in the north. Little break. And probably also climate might play a role. So the north is also more stable. You might have heard about drought in the southern part of Madagascar. But yeah, so it's more variable and there's less rainfall there. So climate stability can also play a role there. And the colonization there was really, really low, actually, when you think about how fast the species move or get to a new place. In this case, it was lower than the speciation rate. So the idea here is that the niche filling is just too slow. Okay. And then there's again the theoretical insight, and we are essentially discussing that the full model didn't work. And the main reason is that the speciation rate and the extinction rate is just so correlated. And so we cannot distinguish about which one, the absolute rate cannot be distinguished, but the relative rate. The other thing that we are thinking, and this is more for the data actually side, is that did we actually have all the summary statistics? Did we miss something in our data that we didn't know or we should use? Until today, I don't have the answer, or also I haven't thought about this since it was published. So, that's one thing, but also the main message here I'm trying to convey is like when we see data, what kind of information actually your data is bringing? Are we overseeing things, or there's something really happening there? And this is a balance between information in the data and the statistical machinery. Again, I don't have a solution, but it's some sort of like food for thoughts. Okay, so this is the general take home here. Is like I'm trying to always advocate that we need the mechanistic understanding, and I'm suggesting that when you have a mechanistic model mixed with statistical, then that might be our best chance. And I'm just gonna again go back to basketball here. But I think at the beginning of the season, they were asking general managers which team would actually win the NBA championships. And I think they were choosing the Brooklyn Nets here. I think they were out in the second round. They're having LA Lakers there in the final. They didn't even make it to the playoff. And so those are the things that you're going to be the expert, but there's still some unknown there. And to a certain extent, I think adding the more mechanistic way is doing that. This is one of those dangerous but cool things. And this is one way of essentially avoiding those spurious correlation here. So this is essentially number of people who drowned, fall into a pool, and the films Nicolas Cage is appearing in. And this is an extreme example. A lot of people would think like, oh, that's just spurious correlation. We don't know. But if you think about the mechanism, you literally cannot explain what's going on there. We might come up with crazy ideas, but it's probably as crazy as this correlation. So when you look at our data and see correlations there that look really nice, how far do we try to explain this in a more mechanistic way? And so again, from my more theoretical perspective, we're just trying to advocate a thing more about mechanism. And I don't know about machine learning, how much we can trust actually, because machine learning might come up with something like this that you think that, yeah, that makes sense. Well, sometimes in some sense it would do too. Okay, So that's the science. I don't know if that's more fun than what's coming next. But it's some sort of like I decided to return to Madagascar about 3-4 years ago. To train a little bit the students, because I'm doing quantitative science, and Madagascar is generally very descriptive, taxonomic, down to the field work, and there was this niche gap or this gap, and so I decided to come back there and try to figure out how to do it. And Brian and I actually almost met by accident. He didn't know I existed. I barely know who he was because we really come from different angle. But then suddenly we actually had the same idea. And I think that's why this is a nice formula, the formula that we're having in MBC, that people who literally, I'm sorry, Brian, if you see this, almost nothing in common in terms of methodological approach, is like trying to resolve the same problem. And the point here is essentially help them to publish. I think that's the only currency, and we can train them. So I'm sorry if I'm really hard on you sometimes, but I hope it's for the good. And so there's several things about that. There's the role model. I mean, we still want an exercise that I'm trying to tell them is like, if you want to play basketball, I'm sorry, last reference to basketball, you must have an idol. You must like, oh, I want to be like whoever it is. But most of the time when I ask Malagasy scientists, like, who do you want to be? Who's your favorite scientist? And so that's one problem. It can be a foreign scientist or a local scientist. So we actually have a program now where some more successful Malagasy scientist is given a seminar and talks and get them realize that this is a successful and fulfilling career. The second problem in general is that needs. I mean, you cannot, I've seen students write in their master's thesis on a computer using the mouse because the keyboard was dead. Try to do that, that's different. And you need to leave, you need to have food. So we're trying to solve that thing. The third thing that I'm gonna talk here is about the training. So this is like pure training. So what we're doing there, so we actually, for instance, started, one of the idea when I started the position is they need to increase their scientific culture, to put it that way. When I was abroad, I always enjoyed all the talks at the departmental seminar. So you got exposed to all type of ideas. And so we start to do that. Everyone is very enthusiastic to come and give a talk. Shout out again to Numena here, is too busy taking photos, but she's making those flyers. And so we have talks from all over the place. Like, we cannot afford, unfortunately, to invite speakers. We don't have money to do that, but there's researchers coming to Madagascar. So they're always happy when they have time. So also, if you know someone coming there, put us in touch and we'll be happy to find them a spot. I was trying to practice actually this talk until I realized that I gave the talk in Malagasy to a very different audience. So I'm technically given a very different talk here. This is how it works now. It's getting more and more crowded. A lot of people are coming. We eventually removed the tables there because there's not enough space. Someone is gonna be, we're trying to have activities though. It's not all about science. That's her again. We're playing basketball there. Some of us are doing jogging. Nicole is one of our fearless leader in that. And I think you're still jogging here, right? Yes, or running. And those are other activities. That's her. Where we had like Princeton graduates visit Princeton students there. We were doing like theater thing. And so just to bring confidence and everything. So essentially, we're really trying to provide them like the full cocktail or full, what is the thing, buffet of what scientists live and do. We have outreach. Those are high school students who are visiting the center. We're planning to start an outreach program. So instead of just doing science, we're already working with younger kids. So high school and things like that can come and assist research that we're doing here. We have volunteers. This is Leah Baker, who worked with the students for 3 months or whatever. So they were helping with their thesis too, and they look happy. This is, of course, it was something we all have in common, like they need to read papers. you need to read more papers, you have to be aware of what's going on, and we're trying to work on that together. This is a training that they don't even get there sometimes at the university. And one of the new activities that we have now is we're making them debate a team, choose a topic and choose randomly what you're gonna, just to foster something like that. Almost there. There are other things that I've been starting to develop. This is an ugly slide, but I didn't know what else to add. But essentially, there are now like scientific writing courses. I don't think it has existed in Madagascar before, or not at this stage, where we really give them the mechanics of how do you write. Of course, because I'm there, they have to learn probability and statistics and programming and critical thinking. That's also one of my favorite topics. Like our PhD student now, I'm demanding them the same exercise or workload as when we did our PhD. So they have to do book exams, they have to do literature review. So the whole point here is really to raise level. And I think we're so far the only center that is doing that in Madagascar. And there's, of course, the most difficult thing is like, how do you come up with good questions? I'm just going to shout out to Brian here because he has been very important in making all those things together. In terms of questions, because of what the center is doing, there's a very nice integration actually about, okay, so for instance, the discovery there is all the ants and programs that we have there. And the way how it does is that they come up with questions and they work closely with me or us in the center science and mentoring. So there's this tight integration. So now research question is not just something that you come up, but it's built in the center. So if someone wants to, I don't know, if you see like what kind of feed we give to the crickets, then they come to me and then we build the research questions and then we address all the situations. So it's not just like individual projects, this is embedded in those things. And I think that's actually all those things put together, hopefully is our best chance actually to elevate. So I hope to see you soon doing your PhD or something like that. Okay, so I think that's basically what I wanted to say. I want to give acknowledgements to everyone here. And I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you. Yes. Microphone?
Yes. Sorry, it's the first one of these I'm actually doing in person. Wow, it's really nice. I had a quick question about the modeling, the inference modeling that you were doing, the ABC. When you said that you couldn't estimate the speciation and the extinction rates, perhaps because they're too highly correlated with each other. Why is that? I'm curious because the speciation rate, as you showed, declines over time. He's getting accumulation of species slowing down. Does the extinction rate also slow down, or are they both maybe diversity dependent independently?
Yes, so that's a great question. I'm not sweating, I'm just thinking about the answer. So yes, it's only one of the process. So we tried either the speciation rate, so the sympatric, although that's not, the within site or within region speciation rate was diversity dependent. So either that declines or the extinction. I think it gives the same answer, but the reason why we couldn't estimate it in the absolute value is some sort of like exercise. If speciation is 2, extinction is 1, maybe you would actually have the same number of species at the end if you have speciation 4 and extinction 2, right? So they just kind of cancel out each other. So if you want to reproduce the same pattern, you can elevate speciation and extinction will just be estimated higher, and that will give something similar, or you reduce the speciation and the extinction will also go down. So it's really the correlation at the regional level. And it's very tough to get the pool of the present effect, which at least allow you to do that because there are 50 species and you have 5 regions. So it's going to be hard to distinguish those processes. So I would assume, although I would love to start a project about that in the future, like can we actually prove that? That's actually, there's just not enough information in the data. So we shouldn't like just wishfully thinking that I want these parameters fit the model and get the answer. So there's limitations there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I should stop giving theory talk, right? It makes people silent. Questions?
Thank you. I'm not going to ask a science question because that's not my thing. But I did want to ask you about coming back to Madagascar to train future scientists. Do you feel like that? I know that was like a personal commitment, but do you think professionally that like had some impact on your trajectory?
Yes, again, another great question. I'm sweating again. So that was a choice to be made, right? And I think there are different types of scientists. There's some that might be extremely competitive and want to be a professor somewhere. We actually have a very fantastic professor from Madagascar who is just started at UC Berkeley. I know that it's going to take a little bit of toll in some sort of like my natural scientific output, but I think it's more fulfilling. It's hard for me to just live abroad and doing my theory, and people are like keep business as usual in Madagascar. The metaphor I was given is like if I have $1 million, right? I don't have $1 million, but if I have $1 million, I can use the 500,000 to do what I want to do. And then I can donate the 500,000 to help people that is dear to you or help others. The question there is like, of course, I can use the $1 million to make me happy somehow. But actually, if the 500 is enough, I mean, if I produce, let's say 5 papers a year, I'll probably be happy. I don't need to produce 20 to be happy. So this is some sort of the trade-off. To a certain extent, there's also the part where I've been working on foreign systems. So I've worked essentially in boreal temperate systems in the past. And like, well, what if I work system in Madagascar? So in that sense, it's not also a loss. So I will think more. And the systems that we have here, so they have 30 years of data on ants here. I'm just like, yeah, let's feast on that. Or other research on insects that they're doing. So it's a loss in some certain sense, but I'm willing to take because I think, I mean, it's fun and it makes you happy. I mean, I'm not the super competitive. I just like to, boys like to have fun doing research. Yeah.
I want to follow up on that. You know, you worked with Ilkka, Ilkka Hanski, you're at Minnesota and so on, and there's sort of these more or less traditional centers for theoretical ecology in most largely in Northern and Western Europe and in the US. How well integrated do you feel with that community? I mean, it's not a huge community even now. How well integrated do you feel you are or continue to be given your current position?
Yes.
And how well do your colleagues, I guess, respond to that?
Oh, this is one of those moments where I have slides that might answer that. Like never happened in the past. So I actually just came back from a meeting with them in Canada. This is a round trip. So we were still strongly collaborating. Not this one, these are things that we did, but we had this meeting actually, which is like advancing. This is an NSF granted. And this is, I mean, there are just 30 of us. This is kind of, I don't know, super, how am I going to say that? I'm starting to lose words here. This doesn't directly answer your questions, but I mentioned earlier about how the white professors are there, and that's what we see there, but things are changing. So for this year, for instance, the MacArthur Award is Priyanka. She's in LA, actually. So we see diversity. this is the team that we've worked in on. And this is a powerful message that we all want to say, because this is theoretical ecology, but there are also a lot of diversity and women. Unfortunately, there's me and Orwe in that group, and we're the male, like colored male, but that alone, not that will keep me, but I have to keep doing theory. So on the side of my director, I'm still working on the theoretical side, and we're actively collaborating. We're working on several papers. So I think it's also good that actually, for instance, that I left. So we have that dot on the map that would increase the distribution. But yes, I mean, we're very tightly integrated and we're still collaborating. And for those those are really good people in mathematics. So don't try to say like there's a stereotype and who can do math or not. Is it like the end or you have a question? Okay.
Well, I was just wondering, for you as a scientist, what were some of the most formative moments in, making you want to follow this path and kind of just like what we were just talking about, but for you personally?
You're talking a path about theoretical ecology, or going back to Madagascar, or giving a talk today?
Oh, great question. All of the above. Your favorite?
Well, my favorite, you mean? Or,
yeah, your favorite of the three. Like what was a formative moment in just a moment that was really important for you in deciding your career path in theoretical ecology?
Yes. So yes, because I'm still like the outlier there, unfortunately, in Madagascar. All the more reason to go back there and hopefully. Well, I always loved math. And that was some sort of like fun things to do. I know a lot of us are not thinking like that, but it can be fun sometimes, or most of the time. But I think it's also more beautiful when you apply to something, when you learn a mathematical concept and you say like this applies in real life in one way or another. And so I always wanted to apply mathematics to something. If I was money greedy, for instance, I would go to finance or economy, but this is where I just like to be in the forest and just hanging out there. So now I'm combining those things, and so it worked. So yeah, I didn't even know that there was something called theoretical ecology when I started. I just want to do math, and I saw a paper in ecology with an equation like this, like I want to do this, and I looked at the author, and that was Otso, Ovaskainen and Ilkka Hanski, and I emailed them, and they were, I was lucky. They say like, oh, come here, let's talk about that. So also it's nice that you don't have competitions sometimes, like they don't hear mathematicians emailing them like, hey, I want to do this thing. So that was probably one of the, but to be honest, or to be more serious, I think all those steps I've been incredibly lucky, from doing a PhD in Finland to go into the US. What I always say is like, why did I end up in Minnesota, in Wisconsin? And I'm saying that to Californians, but I just love the cold. Sorry, guys. And so even when I had to choose a place to go, I was looking for something like that. And even the position with Brian, that's so all of those things are key moments, which I often attribute to how just lucky I am sometimes, like being maybe at the right place in the right time. Let's hope it continues. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll still be here tomorrow and today, so I'll always be happy to chat. Thank you very much, Glade, for Gail. Sorry for your help. Good.
Well, I think with that, we will wrap it up.
Thank you.
Yeah. But
Yep.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much for presenting today. It was a great talk.
My pleasure. Thank
Really
you.
lovely to have you.
Thanks.